Okay. Morning, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of channeling. We're talking about working on the idea that whatever God created, including our emotions and our personality traits, all have a purpose, and therefore even those emotions which are normally considered negative have a purpose and have a way to positively express them, positive expression. And we've been working on the principle that there's a journey on how to do that, and it's a 3 parts, 3 stages, where first we need to reject the negativity, we need to work on removing the ego, and then we talk about the idea of hitkalalut, which is the interacting, learning how to use our different emotions together, where when we are locked in our ego, it's very difficult to do that. We use emotions to the extreme, but if we're able to interact them and integrate them, then it becomes easier. Now, last week we talked about revenge, a very unhealthy and destructive emotion. But we also, at the end, talked about the room and the way to channel revenge into a positive thing. And just to review, we talked about 3 things. That revenge also has a healthy sense of justice, and that's a good thing sometimes. We spoke a lot about the idea of not being silent, but doing it properly. In other words, not being silent in the face of evil, something which we're experiencing on a global level as well, unnecessary or bad silence. And then just the determination, the real revenge, which is the determination not to be knocked down by evil, and to show that we can triumph over adversity, and we can be resilient, and we can produce and achieve, and so on and so forth. So that's what we spoke about last week in terms of revenge. Now, before we go on, I just want to talk about the emotion that we're going to discuss today. I wanted to just share 2 points. The first is that this concept that we're discussing, the need to find positive expression of those emotions which we normally call negative, is actually expressed very beautifully in the words of King Solomon. I should have shared this in the beginning, but King Solomon wrote one of his books called this Kohelet, which I can never pronounce in English. Ecclesiastics. It's hard when you grow up only knowing it in Hebrew then. Ecclesiastics, that's it. I have no idea what the word ecclesiastics means, but I know what Kohelet means. Okay. And in Kohelet, King Solomon says the following. He says beautifully, it's like so exactly what we're talking about. He says everything has a purpose and everything has a time. So he says there's a time to cry, there's a time to laugh. There's a time to hug and embrace, and there's a time to not hug and embrace. Lirchok, to keep a distance. There's a time to seek, there's a time to destroy. There's a time to hold things, there's a time to throw away things. There's a time to tear, there's a time to sow. There's time to be silent, there's time to speak. And then he says there's a time to hate, and even a time to love, and even a time to hate. There's a time for war and a time for peace. In other words, a lot of these things we would normally say are positive, a lot of these things we would normally say are negative. Yet King Solomon's point is that there's some good in everything, and therefore there's a time for everything. There's even a time to hate, which we'll get to, not today. Depending on what we're hating and how we're expressing the hate, and so on and so forth. So that's just so beautifully clearly expressed by King Solomon. The second thing I wanted to mention is just a very important point, and that is when we talk about channeling, like last week we spoke about not being silent and channeling the concept of revenge into a positive expression, a positive space. It is a necessary thing to do, but it's actually difficult. What I mean by that is one always has to be very reflective, to consult, to talk, to discuss with others, to really review and think about whether it's actually being positively channeled or not. Because when we express emotions that are normally considered negative, that positive expression, we need to make sure that it's coming from a good place. And it's not coming with the ego. And that's very confusing sometimes. So even, for example, we talked about last week, the idea of not being silent, speaking up. Speaking up is good, but it's not always good. It depends why we're doing it, depends what we're doing it for, and depends where it's coming from. Right? So when people make trouble and they speak up and they destroy relationships and it's all in the name of I'm going to stand up for what's right. It's not always. It's sometimes driven by a egocentric agenda, sometimes driven by selfish interests. Normally when you give and you love, it's much easier to make sure that it's been done properly, right? The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe once said that you always have to know, he says, he was very tolerant or accepting of someone that was doing something very wrong. I don't know exactly the details of the story, but this is the gist of it. So someone said to him that in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says about a certain person that you have to reject them. And driven by the idea, you have to stand up for evil and stand up and oppose and so on. So he said to this fellow, he said, I want to explain to you something. Do you know where in Shulchan Aruch it's written? He said, in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, there are 4 sections. Each section is very long. It's got lots and lots of chapters. This particular law you're mentioning is in the 4th section at the very end. He said, when you make sure you keep the whole thing, let me know, because then we'll talk about it. What he meant to say is like, it's got to be in context. In other words, there is a really, sometimes there are some really good positive expressions of revenge, like we spoke about last week, and it's all important. But I guess I'm clarifying that when we do that, we always have to make sure that it's coming from the right place. And if you're not sure, we need to ask. We need to consult with others, people that we trust. Because sometimes we need to stand up. Sometimes we need to be aggressive. Sometimes there's even a room for hate, as we'll talk about in the coming weeks. But when those kind of things are positively expressed, we always have to ensure that it's been driven by the right agenda and the selfless agenda rather than by our own ego. Because ego is very confusing. It can be sometimes cloaked in a very righteous cloak, and it's not, right? Okay. Following on from that, let me go to today's emotion. And today I want to talk about jealousy, envy, jealousy. A very problematic emotion. So, one of the dictionary definitions for jealousy is it's a resentment against a rival, a person enjoying success or advantage, etc., or against another success or advantage itself. Now, jealousy is a very, very powerful emotion, a very destructive emotion, and probably more common than revenge. Revenge is really quite an aggressive thing, but jealousy is probably more common than we sometimes like to acknowledge, I suppose. Right? So it's a very important thing to deal with. So what I want to share is, number one, how we deal with the negative part of jealousy, and then understand what is the positive expression of jealousy. So, to do that, let's have a look at the biblical source, first of all, about the prohibition of jealousy. Now, it's very interesting. It's actually one of the 10 Commandments. But let me give you the context of what I want to share with you first, because it's quite interesting, the nuances here. In the Torah, the 10 Commandments are written twice. By the way, it's obviously relevant to this time of the year, and 4 weeks from now, 3 weeks actually, 3 weeks from the Saturday night will be Shavuot, where we actually celebrate the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, where the 10 Commandments were given, right? So, in the Torah, the 10 Commandments are recorded twice. Once in Exodus, Shemot, where the story happened, and once later on in the Torah, Deuteronomy, where a lot of the principles and the foundations of the Torah are repeated. And what's fascinating, and the commentaries deal with this on many, many levels, is the slight changes in wording that we find from the first set of commandments to the second. It's not for today to discuss why the changes are in one or the other, but we need to take them both because there's some very interesting nuances. So the way it works is like this. In the first, let me show you the verses. So the red is the words that I really want to focus on. So in the first 10 commandments, we have the command, in fact it's the 10th one, that says, Lo tachmod. Lo tachmod means you shall not covet. Right? Your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, the slave, the oxes, whatever, and so on and so forth. Right? In other words, don't covet things that belong to other people. Right? Now, I'm not 100% sure what the word in English covet actually means, but I'll tell you what halachically tachmod means. Right? So halachically what this actually means, what the prohibition is actually saying, is if you see someone that owns something or has something, right? Use modern technology, be a new gadget, a car or something, right? And you are jealous, you want that thing. So, lo tachmod means do not do anything to pressure the person either to give it to you or to sell it to you, but any pressure you put on the person to take it away from them is a violation of lo tachmod. In other words, lo tachmod itself is not the emotion, it's actually the action, it's doing something about it. However, when we go to the second set of 10 commandments, the way it's repeated, we suddenly have two expressions, which is lo tachmod and lo titaveh. Titaveh means do not crave, don't even want it. That's jealousy. That's the emotion of jealousy. In other words, the concept of, I wish I really had that. Even if I'm not going to do anything about it, that self is a problem. Okay? Now, many commentaries talk about the differences, and I'm just quoting to you one of the great commentators called the Sefer HaChinuch. He was a 13th century Spanish Jewish scholar. We don't know his name, incidentally. He published a book called Sefer HaChinuch anonymously. We do know it was written to his son, because often he makes references when he says, and now Beni, now my son, let me explain to you. And he wrote on all the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, and he always gives a little bit of a philosophical explanation, halachic explanation, and so on. So in these two commandments, he says the following. He says, number one, he says, thoughts of jealousy, of craving what belongs to someone else, is very destructive for others and destructive for the human being itself, which we'll talk about soon. And he says, based on Maimonides, the Rambam, he says, let us be clear that these are two separate commandments. Tachmod and titaveh are two separate commandments. The first one is a prohibition against doing something about pressuring, not talking about stealing. Even if you pressure someone, I really need your car, right? I need something that belongs to you. Someone to pressure you to give it to me, either as a gift or even to sell it to me. That pressure is a violation of the prohibition of lo tachmod. But he said the second thing, lo titaveh, not to even want it, is a second separate, independent prohibition. And he goes on and he says the following. And he says, ve'al titma, which means don't be surprised. That's okay. He says, don't be surprised. He says, how could the Torah mandate against a feeling, against an emotion? And he explains a very foundational concept. He says, how could it be that the Torah should tell you don't even want that thing? Right? Which is really what jealousy is. Don't even want it. It's an emotion. I either want it or I don't want it, right? He says, because it's not true. He says, enoken. It's not true. He says, this is his words. He says, this is the view of the tipshim, the fools. And those that sin with their own soul, which means those that do things that are spiritually and emotionally unhealthy for themselves. He said, it is in the control of a person to stop themselves and their thoughts and their desires to be channeled in the way that they choose to do it. So what that means is, as the commentators explain, initial emotional thoughts are not in our control. That is true. So we're not, in other words, if we suddenly become jealous, that's not a violation of anything, that's just human nature. But not dealing with it and not getting rid of it, that is a problem. Right? And it is within our control. I'll just show you a little interesting story. Cute little story. There was a disciple of the great Rabbi Dov Meir of Mezrich, called the Maggid of Mezrich. So he had a chassid, he had a follower who came and asked him this question, and he said, Rabbi, I don't understand something. He says, when God tells us to do certain things, if it's actions, I understand you can do it even if you don't want to. In other words, if he tells you to, to put on tefillin, or to do a mitzvah, to put on mezuzah, whatever the case is, and I really don't want to do it, I get it. I can force myself to do it. I get it. I'm in control. Even speech, speech is harder to control. I get it. I can control myself not to say something I shouldn't say. I can control myself to say something that I should say. I get that all, he says. But what I don't understand, he says, how can the Torah govern, same sort of question, how can the Torah govern matters of the heart? It's emotional feelings. He says it's the Torah forbids us even to entertain a thought that is destructive and wrong. How do we do? What am I going to do with these things come into my mind? So instead of answering the question of Dov Meir Mezrich says it's a very good question. The person who I think can answer the question is a very great person. He says, go to my elder disciple who himself is a great man. He lives in Zhitomer. His name is Rabbi Zev. He can answer the question. Okay. So he made the trip, and it's